Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I'm really excited to lead this webinar with you on Woodland Landowner Considerations for Forest Carbon Programs. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Keith Phelps. I'm with UW-Madison Extension Forestry. So for today, what we're going to cover here is I first want to talk a little bit about what I do at the Forest Resilience Program with UW-Madison Extension Forestry. After I get some of those introductions out of the way, I want to launch into the basics of forest carbon markets. So forest carbon markets, it's a very complex system. There's a lot of terms, a lot of definitions. So what I want to do is overview three really important concepts and topic areas. So we're going to discuss the science of forest carbon. After that, we're going to look at forest carbon markets themselves, define carbon credits, and then afterwards, we'll look into measuring forest carbon. Those three concepts will set us up really well to have a discussion on Midwest forest carbon programs. We're going to look at three different carbon programs that are currently operating in the Midwest, as well as elsewhere in the United States. And we'll talk about some of their basic eligibility requirements. After we review those programs, then we're going to launch into thinking about management considerations, some key questions that you should be asking yourselves, as well as other forestry professionals, if you are curious or interested in enrolling in forest carbon markets. And I do want to provide you with some additional resources, some things that you can learn about. We have a lot of content today to get through regarding forest markets, carbon markets, but I do want to leave some time for a question and answer session with you all. So I am really concerned with this forest resilience outreach and education. To do that, I focus on two major topic areas. So one would be forest carbon market education, hence why I'm speaking to you all today. We have developed a lot of different fact sheets, a lot of online website learning tools for this topic, as well as some additional webinars that we have led with UW-Madison Extension. With forest carbon market education, our goal is to not say that no one should enroll in a forest carbon program or everybody should enroll in a forest carbon program. The decision to enroll in a forest carbon program is really going to be dependent on the management decisions that are happening in your woodlands, your goals, your objectives, and if they are compatible with those in a forest carbon program. So I am not affiliated with any project developers, project programs, so it's really important for us to remain neutral and to help landowners make the most informed decisions they can to benefit their land, their woods, their families, and for the future of their states. So in addition to forest carbon, we also talk a lot about forest resilience. So resilience is the capacity of a forest to respond to a disturbance, resist stress, and recover quickly. So when we think about a lot of changing conditions, climate change, forest ecological issues in our woods, the Forest Resilience Program helps us to think about active forest management that we can do in order to promote ecologically healthy woods. So in those topic areas, we discuss invasive plant management, emerald ash borer management. We discuss promoting prescribed fire in woods that could benefit from it, such as those with oak and pine. And then we also discuss a lot about tree regeneration, ways to promote tree regeneration in species that are declining or seeing conditions that are hampering their regeneration. So with that topic area, we lead webinars, we do some online courses. On the screen here, you'll see some resources to some of the websites that we have. In addition, you can always reach out to me via email. We do have social media where we've talked about some of these topics, and you can always subscribe to our newsletter. All right, so let's dive into the meat of the webinar here. And we're first going to review some basics around forest carbon science. So forest carbon is really important as nationwide our forests absorb 10 to 15% of the US's annual greenhouse gas emissions. When we think about climate change, the effects of climate change and concerns about greenhouse gas emissions, Forests have been seen as a natural solution to help mitigate the effects of climate change. Forests, trees are naturally going to absorb carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis, and that's why they have emerged as a really important mechanism that a lot of researchers are looking at. In Wisconsin, our forests hold over 1 billion metric tons of carbon. And in northern Wisconsin, we see that our private owners hold about 63% of the forest carbon stock. So there's a lot of interest in these project developers, these project programs, because there is that rich resource of forests and potential forest carbon stock that can be used to generate forest carbon credits. Half of the dry weight of a tree is going to be carbon. So if you think about one tree, cutting that tree down, drying it out, half of that dry weight would be carbon. Looking at another equivalent here, 1 cord of freshly cut pine logs is going to be approximately 128 cubic feet. That is also equivalent to 0.6 metric tons of carbon. And since I am from Wisconsin, that is also equivalent to the weight of a full-grown Holstein cow. It's important to understand where carbon is coming into a forest ecosystem and how it moves through the ecosystem. So I want to review this carbon cycle in forests and look at this diagram in depth. So first, we're going to start out with photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the natural process by which plants, trees included, they're going to be absorbing or pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They are then going to be using that to create nutrients, to create carbohydrates, to help with metabolic processes and grow. And with the carbon that is drawn in through photosynthesis, it's going to be stored in the live above ground biomass and branches and leaves and the trunk. And then we also see it showing up in the live below ground biomass, such as the roots. We can think about this action, photosynthesis, as sequestration when we think about the carbon system as a whole. So sequestration, it's a term for just thinking about pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As trees grow, they're naturally going to expel or lose some carbon through the process of cellular respiration to do their metabolism. As trees mature and die, they are going to decompose, and that's going to release some carbon as well. But healthy functioning forests, especially in the upper Midwest, they are going to be pulling in, sequestering far more carbon than they lose. In effect, they are carbon sinks. They're going to be pulling in more carbon. As we look at this diagram, we can see different carbon pools or areas in the forest where carbon is being stored. So one really important pool is going to be the live above ground biomass. We can then have a carbon pool in the soil. And in fact, in our northern forests, in Wisconsin especially, we see that around 51% of the total carbon is stored within the soil. But it's much more difficult to measure soil carbon in the soil. So that's why a lot of researchers and a lot of these forest carbon programs, they look at the live trees to measure change in forest carbon. Other carbon pools we can have carbon being stored in the leaf litter. And as those trees mature and they die, they become deadwood, dead standing trees or snags and logs. And that is also a really important carbon pool. Two terms that we're seeing, sequestration and storage, a really great analogy is to think about these two terms in bank accounts. So sequestration is going to be acting like the deposits in a bank account, and storage is the bank account itself. How much carbon is going to be in a forest is going to depend on a variety of different factors, but a really important one is going to be forest type or the species of trees. So this graph is looking at the above forest carbon stored per acre on average for different forest types in Wisconsin. On the low end, we have jack pines, which hold about 9 Ford F-150s per acre of carbon. Let's contrast that with our maple beech birch forests, which hold about 20 Ford F-150s per acre of carbon. Another really important factor that is going to influence how much carbon is in a forest is going to be the forest age. So looking at this graph, we have the average above ground and below ground biomass of carbon per acre by forest type and 30-year age classes in Wisconsin. At the high end, zooming in the middle of our graph here at Maple Beech birch forests that are 120 years in age, very mature forests, they are going to have the greatest overall carbon storage. Then when we look at the younger forests of 0 to 30 years, they're going to have the least amount of carbon storage. But then look at that jump from 0 to 30 to 31 to 60. We see a massive increase in carbon sequestration because the trees are growing very, very rapidly. And as the forest matures, growth is going to naturally slow down a little bit, so the rate of carbon sequestration is going to slow down as well. The big takeaway here is that older forests sequester carbon more slowly, but they have a larger total carbon storage. There are other factors that are going to influence how much carbon is in a forest beyond just the forest cover type and the forest age. A good example of that would be forest health. But forest cover type and forest age really help us predict, measure, estimate how much carbon is in a forest ecosystem. So they are really, really important factors for us to consider. Okay, with that grounding in the basic of forest carbon science, I now want to move on to discuss carbon markets themselves and look a little bit about carbon credits and discuss how carbon credits are generated. So if we're going to discuss carbon markets, we first need to discuss carbon credits. They are going to be the foundation of a carbon market system. They are going to be what is bought and sold. So one carbon credit is going to be equivalent to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent greenhouse gas such as methane that's either removed from or not emitted into the atmosphere in the first place. Because of this definition, we have 2 major ways in which carbon credits are created. We can have removal credits, again, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or we can have avoidance credits, preventing carbon dioxide from being emitted into the atmosphere. Because of this, when we see and look at removal credits and avoidance credits, we see the carbon market system as a whole really valuing these removal credits more than avoidance credits. When we think about forest carbon markets, avoidance credits are really preventing deforestation from happening, and it's difficult to account for that when we are quantifying carbon credits. It's much more easier to do that for these removal credits. I want to point out that we are discussing forest carbon markets, but carbon markets exist in other sectors such as agriculture and renewable energy, in addition to forestry. Carbon credits are generated through a variety of different processes, but one really important one is going to be improved forest management strategies. So these are going to be sustainable forest activities that maintain or increase carbon in the forest. Think about this as a departure from the traditional business as usual forest management to really focus on growing out more carbon within the forest. This improved forest management strategy, these are going to be removal credits. 2 really important mechanisms that show up in improved forest management are going to be extended harvest rotation. So if you think about a typical forest stand that may have a typical forest harvest entry, we are then going to tack on, say, an additional 10 or 20 years before we do that harvest in order to grow out more carbon in the woods. Then we can have harvest deferral. So thinking about that same forest stand, we're going to say we are not going to harvest for 20 years in order to grow out that carbon. We see improved forest management as really gaining in popularity. Market transaction volume has tripled from 2023 to 2024 using improved forest management to generate these carbon credits. Other mechanisms are going to be reforestation and afforestation. This is going to be adding trees to the landscape through tree planting, And then avoided conversion. When we discuss that, avoided conversion just means preventing deforestation from happening. These three strategies, reforestation, afforestation, and avoided conversion, they're more common internationally and not as common in the US. There are some reforestation and afforestation programs that are in operation in the Southeast United States, but to my knowledge, we do not have any of those tree planting programs yet operational in the Midwest. Companies are going to buy these carbon credits to offset their net emissions for greenhouse gases. So now with climate change, a lot of companies are thinking about ways to reduce their overall net emissions or to have a carbon neutral emission policy. So through that monitoring, a company may find out that they are above their net emission target goals. They can then purchase these carbon credits to offset those emissions and reach their net target goals. We do have two types of carbon markets that are in operation today. So we can have compliance markets. These are going to be mandatory participation for certain sectors of the economy. A good example of this would be electrical utilities. These are going to be run by government entities. And if you've heard of the California cap and trade, that is an example of the compliance market. Let's contrast that with voluntary markets. As their name suggests, voluntary markets are going to be voluntary participation, where certain companies, organizations, individuals want to voluntarily reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but they are not required to do so. These are going to be run by non-governmental groups. And just to give you a scale of the volume, in 2024, we see 535 million total for the voluntary market system, of which 342 million was in forestry and land use carbon credits. A big takeaway that I want to impart here is that the three different project developers or project programs that we're going to talk in a little bit about later in this webinar, they all connect landowners to the voluntary carbon market. So say if you were to sign up for one of these three programs, you would be participating in the voluntary market, not in the compliance market. It can be difficult to understand the structure of these carbon markets, to understand who the key players are. I want to unpack this diagram a little bit and just discuss who some of these key players are so we have a better understanding of the carbon ecosystem as a whole. This diagram really reflects a voluntary carbon market program, so it gives a nice overview of if you are a landowner and if you are signing up for a project developer. So on the top end of the scale, we're going to look at foresters first. The forester could be a consulting forester hired by the landowner, could be a Department of Natural Resource forester. In some instances, project developers will have foresters on staff who may be hired or contracted to work with the landowner. But the forester really is that consulting body that advises the landowner. Next, we have the project developers. You've heard me kind of interchange project developers with project programs, and that's what I refer to when we discuss carbon or project developers. So land yield, Family Forest Carbon Program, Forest Carbon Works, the different project developers that we're going to talk about next are all examples of these project developers. There are many others that are operating globally as well as in the United States, but these three are the ones that you are going to encounter most in the Midwest. The project developers all consult with the landowner. They agree to contracts in order to generate carbon credits on private land. Moving on down the chain, we have some entities that the landowners, the foresters are not going to interact with, but the project developers will. These are going to be carbon standards and registries. These are going to be entities that set rules, approve methodologies for how carbon credits are generated. They issue, transfer, retire credits. Verra and ACR are good examples of carbon standard and registry. And then we have validation and verification bodies. So these are going to be third-party auditors. They're going to determine how many credits are generated, and they're going to validate projects, verify credits. So these entities really form as checks on the system. They help us ensure that we have high quality credits moving through to the end buyers. So as carbon credits are approved, they can then go to marketplaces. So some developers won't use these marketplaces or intermediaries to sell carbon credits. They may sell directly to end buyers, which are going to be the corporations, individuals, nonprofit groups, or public entities who are all seeking to reduce their overall carbon emissions. So I'll just pause here to look at this diagram one more time. We see at the top level, we have the forest landowners interacting with the project developers. Then we have some entities that are only interacting with the project developers. And we see how the carbon credits moves through that entire market ecosystem. All right, the last topic that I want to review before we look at some of those project developers who are operating in the Midwest is how we measure forest carbon. So every forest carbon is going to use specific approved methodology for measuring forest carbon, and that is going to help them calculate carbon credits. When we look at carbon credits being, or carbon being measured, carbon credit programs generally focus on the live biomass. Think about the trunks, the branches of trees. Because that live biomass, it's going to be a lot more easier to measure and to think about change through different forest management practices. So as a rule of thumb, about half of the dry mass of a tree is carbon. So thinking about that, we have a really great way for using on-site measurements to quantify carbon. So we can measure a tree's diameter at breast height, and we can then calculate the tree's dry weight. Again, half of it is carbon. We can use equations and repeat this for many trees and extrapolate those forest inventories to estimate total above ground carbon. These equations are adjusted for stand density and for tree species. This is a really accurate way to measure and to estimate carbon. However, it can be very costly because it takes a lot of time and money to perform that forest inventory out in the field. Another mechanism for measuring carbon is using standardized estimates with the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis. So this program has established research plots in every state across the United States. These plots are remeasured every 7 years. And in Wisconsin, we have about 6,000 FIA plots. So this helps us to estimate how much forest carbon is going to be in a stand, given its species composition and given its age. So these standardized estimates allow us to estimate carbon across a bigger landscape area. A third approach is going to be remote sensing. And we see this as very popular with a lot of the project developers that are operating today. Basically, from the air, using planes, helicopters, drones, or even satellites, we're going to be measuring the light reflected by the landscape. That data allows us to model tree heights, canopy structure, general health of the forest. And then we can use other computer models to convert that information into forest carbon estimates across a very big area. The benefit here is it enables more frequent monitoring, and it is a very efficient way to model and to estimate forest carbon. However, it always needs to be calibrated with some on-the-ground measurements, and different project developers have different mechanisms for using remote sensing, all with their pros and all with their cons. And then when we think about measuring forest carbon, these are some other really important concepts that come up, this concept of baseline and additionality. So baseline is going to represent the amount of carbon that a forest would have stored without enrollment in a carbon program. So different projects are going to take different approaches to determine a baseline, in each with its strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. But this additionality refers to the amount of carbon stored as a result of a specific management action. So when we talked about those improved forest management strategies, such as harvest deferral or extended harvest rotation, those are all practices that increase carbon storage, and that is our demonstration of additionality. So forests naturally grow and they're going to store carbon over time. So we need to demonstrate that additional carbon is being stored through the use of those improved forest management strategies. We always have to compare that with what would have happened if there was no intervention in the forest in the first place. Then we need to think about how long carbon is going to be locked or stored, and what if things go wrong. So most carbon programs, in order to represent a true carbon credit, that carbon needs to be stored and remain out of the atmosphere for at least 100 years or more. This comes into play when landowners, they're typically entering longer term contracts in order to monitor and ensure permanence in those carbon credits. Reversal is going to be an unexpected loss of carbon or slower than anticipated tree growth. So this can happen if we have disturbance events such as wildfires, insect outbreaks, which leads to the death of many trees in a forest in a quick amount of time, and we have a lot of carbon being expelled. It can also happen if, say, we are enrolled in a harvest deferral program, a harvest occurs on the forest stand, that is over harvesting, that is an unexpected slow growth, loss of carbon in that stand. So the project developers are always going to have a buffer pool. These are going to be forest carbon credits that are really used as an insurance instead of being sold in the case that there are these unexpected events. Leakage is the last important term that we're going to look at here. Developers always have to account for the possibility that less harvesting in one place, so say we are in an improved forest management, forest carbon program, where there might be a harvest deferral, or there might be an extended harvest rotation, that could lead to more harvesting in another place to keep up with the lumber timber demands. So just thinking about this diagram, Forest 1, it's enrolled in that improved forest management plan. Forest 2 is not. There could be increased harvesting intensity. So when carbon credits are generated, leakage is also accounted for in the models. All right, so we have covered the basics of forest carbon science, forest carbon markets, as well as how we measure forest carbon in the first place. Now I want to discuss those three project developers, those three project programs that are operating in the Midwest that landowners could potentially enroll in. Before we look at the basic eligibility requirements of these three project developers, I want to point out some important aspects that all of these programs share. For one, this is a way for landowners to get revenue for generating forest carbon credits in voluntary markets. Landowners are going to retain full ownership and private property rights. There's going to be no change in recreational rights, so no change in how we hunt, how we fish, and recreate on the property. Firewood harvesting is still going to be allowed. However, there might be certain cordage limits in each program. And then if timber harvesting is not allowed on the property, say it's tied into an existing conservation easement that bars timber harvesting from happening, then that property is likely ineligible for enrollment in a forest carbon program. Invasive species management is encouraged. Other forms of management, such as prescribed fire, might be allowed as well, but prescribed fire is a case-by-case thing where we would have to interact and research more with the project developers themselves. The first program that we'll look at the basic eligibility requirements is going to be the Family Forest Carbon Program, or FFCP. So this is a nonprofit program with its service area of the northern third of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. The forest cover type that is accepted in this program is going to be all mature native forest except aspen and birch. Acreage, the landowner is going to need 30 acres or more to participate. And the contract duration, if the landowner is to sign up, they are signing up for a contract that is 20 years in length. The payment is going to be a fixed rate, and this equates to roughly $10 an acre annually. This is going to be dependent on the forest cover type and the forest age, the forest stands itself. Harvesting is still going to be allowed, but there's going to be certain basal area limits and restrictions. And then other important aspects, this program will allow for parcel land enrollment. So say we have 60 acres of forested property, we would not need to enroll the entirety of that forested property. To participate in FFCP, you must have a forest management plan. However, FFCP can provide for financial support for forest plan development. Forest Carbon Works is another program that we see. The service area is going to be all lower 48 states. So in contrast to FFCP, which is really only available in the upper Midwest, this is available across the lower 48 states. The forest cover type is going to be all native forest above 5-inch diameter at breast height. So this program can accept some of those less mature forests in contrast with FFCP, which is going to be accepting mature forest. The acreage, however, is going to be 500 acres or more. So as a landowner, you would need at minimum 500 acres to enroll in this program. The contract duration is going to be 40 years in length. And the payment rate is going to look a little bit differently. Instead of that fixed payment, we're going to do a 35% revenue share. So of the forest carbon credits that are generated on the property, you would get 35% revenue of that. Roughly estimating this equates to about $10 to $15 an acre annually. And then, like the other program, harvesting is still going to be allowed, but there's going to be certain restrictions on the growth. And then other things, much like the same program, this is going to allow for partial land enrollment. And if harvesting, you must have a forest management plan. I want to pause here and point out that Forest Carbon Works, as well as FFCP, they're all going to be using that improved forest management extended harvest rotation in order to generate those carbon credits. The last program that we'll talk about is going to be land yield. So the land yield service area is going to be certain areas in the United States, Northeast, Midwest, Southeast US. Unfortunately, Iowa is not represented in their service area. The forest cover type that this program accepts is going to be all native mature forest. And acreage is going to be 40 acres or more. The landowner would need at minimum 40 acres. The contract duration, like Forest Carbon Works, is going to be 40 years. And the payment is actually going to be a combination of fixed payment for the first 3 years, and then in years 4 to 20, it is going to move to a 55% revenue share model. I'll point out that with land yield, an important distinction is that this is a harvest deferral program. So there would be no commercial timber harvesting allowed for 20 years. Other things, this program will also allow for partial land enrollment, and a forest management plan is not necessarily required to participate. Now that we understand that there are 3 project developers, 3 project programs that Midwest landowners could enroll in, I want to offer up some management considerations that we ask landowners to reflect on if they are curious about enrollment in a forest carbon program. So first thing, I think it's important for us to weigh the pros and the cons of a forest carbon program. So potential pros is this is an additional revenue stream for forest management. We can use the revenue from for enrollment in a forest carbon program in order to help pay property taxes, in order to help us conduct other forest management, such as invasive plant management. In addition, we're assisting in the reduction of carbon pollution. For a lot of landowners, that's a really important, huge goal that makes them feel very, very great about participating in a forest carbon program. And in some respects, we're increasing the tree age, growing out more carbon. That can help to improve forest structure by having more mature trees on the landscape. It can help us with wildlife habitat, for example. There are benefits in having those increased tree age to diversify forest structure. Some cons, we have lengthy contract periods. So recall that a lot of these project developers, they have to demonstrate permanence, that these carbon credits, they're keeping carbon dioxide, carbon out of the atmosphere for at least 100 years. And that's why we have these lengthy contract periods to ensure that proper monitoring is being demonstrated. Some forest cover types or ages may not qualify. Depending on where we are in the Midwest, we may have limited options to participate in a forest carbon program. And if we have non-native forest cover types, that probably will not be accepted. Revenue may change during the duration of the contract. This is the carbon market system, so sometimes it's a market system. So sometimes the market may be strong, sometimes it may be a little bit weaker. And if we have those revenue share options, that can be reflected in the overall payout. I do want to say that we can manage for forest carbon without being enrolled in a forest carbon program. So there are a lot of different strategies that we can do that really benefit the forest ecological health, and they benefit carbon sequestration, carbon storage. So strategies such as leaving coarse woody debris, downed logs, retaining some snags, that helps us to increase the overall carbon pool of that deadwood material in the woods. That offers a lot of wildlife benefits as well, of leaving those dead material for nesting birds, for woodpeckers, for amphibians. We can also do things that preserve soil water and soil health, water quality. These are all initiatives that can really help with carbon storage and carbon sequestration as well. So we don't necessarily have to participate in a forest carbon program if we want to increase carbon storage within our woods. After we weigh pros and cons, we then need to think about the management objectives, the management goals of our woods. It's always really important to think about our goals for our woods, what we want them to look like now and into the future, and the management activities we want to conduct in order to fill out those goals, those objectives, and that overall vision for our woods. So some goals that would likely be compatible is if we are concerned with wildlife that depend on middle-aged or old-growth forest. Recall that we are growing out more carbon. We might have harvest deferrals. We might have extended harvest rotations. That could all be likely compatible. If we are really concerned with recreation, if we are managing invasive species, these are all things that are likely compatible. I think something that is overlooked is your heirs agree with your vision. So recall that we have lengthy contracts for signing up for a forest carbon program. It's really important to have a conversation with your heirs who may be inheriting that property, who may be managing the property, and ensure that they agree with that vision. If we leave the contract prematurely, we are going to face some financial penalties. So it's always a great idea to have that conversation. Things that would likely not be compatible, if we are having some wildlife habitat management goals where we are really focusing on young forest development, that probably may not be as compatible. If we are really concerned with timber income, this is probably not as compatible with the forest carbon program. And then if our heirs don't agree with the vision, it's probably not as compatible thinking about the long term. I want to offer some different management scenarios to reflect on those pros and cons and just to think about compatibility with different things that we might be doing in the woods. So the first scenario, thinking about our landowners in the southern Midwest, is oak woodland savanna restoration. So typically this involves removing many trees in a short amount of time. We're focusing on retaining open forest structure to have oak trees on the landscape, give them the space that they need for tree regeneration, those oaks that love full sunlight. And because we are reducing basal area and doing other forest management activities like prescribed fire, I would say generally this form of management may not be as compatible with the forest carbon program. Thinking about mature trees, merchantable timber that needs to be in the forest stand, this would be a conversation that you would have to have with the forest carbon programs themselves to see if it is compatible in your situation. Another scenario is thinking about our landowners in the upper Midwest. Say we're doing northern hardwood forest management. So say our objectives here are to increase age classes. Maybe we're trying to grow out some older trees. We are conducting invasive species management, and we're going to be doing some forest thinning and creating some canopy gaps with sustainable harvesting to promote bird habitat and maybe to help along some tree generation that we have seen is a missing deficit in our woods. I would say that this management scenario is very likely compatible with a lot of different forest harvesting programs. And finally, there are some rounds of questions that are really important for us to ask before enrolling. We don't have time to really look at these all in depth, but a few really important ones I want to call out is asking what type of companies will buy the carbon credits associated with your forest. For some landowners, they really want to know what the carbon program is selling those credits to, and that's really important to them. You want to understand if you are going to perform a timber harvest, what are the guidelines? How do you get permission? How does that look like? You want to understand the payment schedule, and you really want to look at the contract that is going to be offered to you to understand that contract before you sign anything. Some other things that we should consider is what happens if you sell or transfer ownership of the land before the end of the contract. In the vast majority of cases, that the carbon contract is going to be tied to the land itself, not the landowner. And if you have existing conservation easements, or say you are enrolled in a forest tax law program, it's really important to ask if you are eligible. This is a case-by-case basis. What the forest carbon program is going to do is they're going to look at your existing conservation easement or the program, the tax law program that you are enrolled in, look at the harvesting requirements, and determine if you are eligible. I want to impart that it's really important to talk with a forester, with a lawyer, to help guide you and help you understand that you are really looking at everything in that contract before signing. It's important that you ask questions and that you really understand what is being said in that contract. We're approaching towards the end of this presentation here, but I want to offer some additional forest carbon resources for you to explore at your own time. And we'll drop some of these resources links into the chat itself. So at UW-Madison Extension, we have done an introduction to forest carbon programs. This webinar really explores in depth the things that I am discussing with you all today. The difference is that we interviewed 2 project developers. They talked about their eligibility requirements, and we had a really lengthy question and answer discussion with those 2 project developers. So that's a really good opportunity for you to kind of hear from these project developers, hear about what they say about their programs, and what they can offer to landowners. On the right, you'll see this QR code. If you scan it, that's going to link to our Forest Carbon Markets Learning Hub. This is an online resource that really focuses on the key topic areas that I discussed with you all today, reviewing forest carbon science, reviewing the structure of forest carbon markets, how carbon credits are generated, and then we also talk about measuring carbon and basic eligibility requirements for these different project developers and project programs. Keep in mind that this is a fast-moving market system. Eligibility requirements may change. So it's always a really good idea to also have conversations with these project developers so you are up to date about recent changes and as up to speed as possible. Some other research or other resources that are going to be available on our website through UW-Madison Extension Forestry. We have these printable PDF fact sheets. So if you explore that Carbon Market Learning Hub, you can print off these PDF fact sheets, again, reviewing some of the most important concepts that we discussed in this webinar here today. And I want to call out others of my colleagues in the Midwest and the Northeast who have developed some really, really great resources that you can explore as well. So Michigan State University has the Forest Carbon and Climate Program. They have really, really great webinars. They have really great resources that talk in depth about forest carbon, including some tools to help you estimate forest carbon with a forester. Another great tool, especially for our landowners that I'll point out, is the Pennsylvania State University Forest Owner Carbon and Climate Education, or FOSSI Hub. So this hub has some really great articles that are geared toward landowner audiences. They have additional resources. They have performed interviews. If you're curious, I would recommend signing up to their listserv. They are a really great resource to do more learning and more exploration. As we move to the Q&A portion, I may not have all the answers to your questions. As I said, this is a fast-moving, fast-evolving market system. So if I'm not able to answer your question today, I really do encourage you to reach out to me via email. We'll get you the answer that you need through some additional searching. If you scan that QR code, you can find my email address, and I would look forward to having a discussion with you.